Now, of course, Chesterman, in his book with his colleague called The Map, they actually explained some of the areas in translation research, which are quite interesting and very, very important. Now, one of the areas that in translation research which can be investigated by students or by researchers is text analysis and translation. And that is when you are analyzing the source text, the ST. You can you can do a comparison between the translations and their source texts, or you can compare the translations with non-translated texts. In other words, you take translations that are, let's say, in the medical field and compare them to other texts that are originally written in the target language, and you do a comparison. And this kind of comparison will be parallel texts. You are paralleling between texts that are translated in the medical field, for example, and texts that are originally written in the medical field. Then there is also a third area in translation research, which is to produce your own translation with commentary. And that is a third form of a third area in translation research. Of course, here, when you are commenting or evaluating your own translation, it will be a little bit biased because you are translating, you are evaluating your own translation. So it's better to do some sort of a survey, ask other translators, get a focus group to actually assess your translation and give you a result or an idea of what do they think of this translation without telling them who has translated this piece of work. And that will be one way of assessing your own translation with commentary in your research. A second form or area in translation research is translation quality assessment. In other words, you are assessing other translation in terms of quality based on certain scholars like Wills, Nord, and House, Julian House, and others who have actually provided a quality assessment of translations over the years. And Nord and House, Julian House, both of them have actually provided recently some books or written some books in 2015, 2016, 17, 18 about quality assessment, which will be interesting. Another area which can be investigated, and some researchers go for it, is to look at genre translation. In other words, it depends on the genre itself. If it's a literary genre, for example, they can focus on drama translation, translation of drama texts, or translation of poetry texts, or translation of prose or fiction. There are others who prefer to talk about multimedia texts, whether it's web multimedia, web translation, or whether it's audiovisual, dubbing, subtitling, and so on. So they choose these texts or these videos, which are in multimedia form, or in a media form which is orality, or audio, or visual, and they can analyze them. There is also in genre translation religious texts, and some choose to discuss some, like for example the Quranic verses being translated, or some hadith, or other religious texts that are either being translated before or they are attempting to analyze and talk about. Another genre which can be investigated also is children's literature. Also, this is another area where you can look at translation in children's literature. E is tourism texts. Tourism texts, you can look at advertising, you can look at tourism and translation, some tourist guides, how they're translating these tourist texts, and how can you analyze them, and how can you look at them and see whether they localize them. In other words, they make them attractive to the target audience. That is for tourism texts. Then you have technical texts, and these can be also about machinery, can be in the medical field, they can be in the pharmaceutical field, they can be in petroleum, engineering, architecture. It can be in any area that is of interest to the researcher. There are also in genre translation documents that are legal. In other words, you want to investigate legal translation. So you look for some certificates, you collect some sort of documents in that area, like contracts and agreements, treaties and conventions and so on and so forth in the legal translation, and discuss it in that way. Now, the multimedia translation, just going into multimedia translation, this is something that is quite interesting as well. You can go for multimedia translation, revoicing, subtitling, dubbing, or in audiovisual. There are lots of various ones: fan subbing, audio description, remakes, film remakes, screenplay texts, and so on. And you can discuss them and you talk about them. Number 5 in areas in translation research can be translation and technology. Perhaps you can evaluate a software like there are some translation software or machine translation as well, and you can investigate that further. Or you can look at CAT, which is computer assisted translation, or machine translation in its various forms. But you need to be, I have to warn you here, you need to be highly technical. You need to understand a lot about technology because it's quite complex and sophisticated. The other one is software localization, how to localize a software so that it will be used in a certain region in terms of numbers and whatever. So you look into software localization, or you look at the effects of technology on translation perhaps, or website translations, or you look at technology and training translators, not only translators but also interpreters, if you want technology and interpreter training. How do they train interpreters? What kind of what is the latest studies? What are the latest studies in this area about translator training, for example, and technology? Do they use management softwares? Do they need to know about these? How do they use them? And so on. You look at scholars who have spoken about translator training. There's also an interpreter and translator training journal well known in the area. Number 6 is translation history. Perhaps you can go back in history and look at this and see who are the translators. You focus mostly on translators themselves. That's one element. Or you can translate on what which is you investigate which texts are translated or not translated in a particular culture or in a particular at a particular time. So you either in translation history, either investigating translators, focusing on translators themselves in terms of history, in terms of their biography, what are the books that you've translated, what's their background, why do they translate certain books and not others, and so on. Or you can look, as I said, about what has been translated over the years. And you investigate which texts are translated and which are not translated in a particular culture at a particular time, and why it's not being translated at that time, at that period of time, or why it's not translated in a particular culture. So you look at that as well. You can look also in the history, translation history, as why, reasons for translating certain texts at particular times. Or you can look at how, which means translating strategies throughout the ages. Through the ages, what are the strategies and how do they change? So there are really 4 different questions in translation history: who, what, why, and how. Then you have ethics, translation ethics, which can be another area in translation research. And that is, you look at different types of ethics. You look at perhaps cultural and ideological factors which affects the way translators actually translate. Or you can look at codes of practice in translation ethics. So you can choose that as another area in translation research. The 8th area, according to Chesterman and his colleague, is that Andrew Chesterman is terminologies and glossaries. You can look at that and investigate that in more details. And of course, number 9 is interpreting. Now, in interpreting, you can look and choose either simultaneous, the mode. You need to decide which mode in your research, which is simultaneous or consecutive, or even both. You can look at the social context, whether it's a conference interpreting, liaison interpreting, court interpreting, social interpreting, health interpreting, public service interpreting, interpreting for the police, interpreting for the courts, and so on. And of course, in terms of the types of studies that are in interpreting, there's quite a lot of them. There are cognitive ones, which are relating to the brain, how the brain works, neurophysiological studies of the interpreter's brain when it is in action. And it can also be the functioning of the memory of the interpreter, in particular in simultaneous interpreting, for example. Or you can look at the effect of time lag, the time lag in interpreting. Behavioral studies you look at, or linguistic studies, or interpreter training, or quality assessment. Or you can look at 2 at the same time. But it's better to be more specific and more narrow the topic as much as possible.